All right, everyone, for those of you that have just joined, if you could kindly input your emails and names into the chat, that would be greatly appreciated.
Oh boy.
No worries, Beverly. I have you down already. No worries.
But I still have to see you, and I have to see what's, you know, to be able to see on the screen, and all I have here.
Yeah, for those of you that have.
Nicole.
Hi, yes. Hello, everyone. For those of you that have just joined, if you could kindly leave your names and your emails into the chat box, that would be greatly appreciated.
Hi, Bev. Are you on?
I'm on, but I can't seem to get to anything. Everything is dancing on my screen here. Everything just shaking. Everything from Google to YouTube to everything, it's dancing. Everything is shaking. I don't know what happened. Yesterday, I was on trying to learn how to get into the chat with that other group, and it acted up and did all kind of foolishness, and it's still not rectified, I think. Oh, now it stops dancing, but it's still not showing me anything.
Able to see me on the screen?
No, I can't see anybody.
What about, do you think you could shut down and start all over and see? Because they have your name down already, right? So if you could maybe totally come out, shut your system down and put it back up again.
All right, I'll shut down and I'll try to come back, see. Or maybe I'll call in by phone.
Yeah, if there's any problem, you can let me know.
Okay. Let me shut down and see what happened. I'll come right back. Maybe 5 minutes.
Yeah, we'll just wait a few more minutes for everyone to join.
Oh my goodness, even when I turned it off, I can still hear.
For those of you that just joined, all right, for those of you that have just joined, if you could kindly leave your names and your emails in the chat box, that would be great. We will be starting in 2 minutes. Hello, everyone. For those of you just joining us again, if you could please kindly drop your names and emails in the chat. Yes, thank you, everyone, for dropping your names and your emails in the chat. For those of you just joining us again, if you could kindly just drop your names and your emails in the chat, that would be really great. All right, I guess we could get started. I do know that we do have, oh, 1 second, everyone. Yes, for those of you just joining us again, if you could please drop your names and your emails in the chat, that would be really great. All right, so first of all, thank you everyone for joining us on this Wednesday evening. First of all, I'd also like to welcome back Dr. Blackwood, who is here with us again. Thank you so much for joining us. We know that we had such a great audience last time who really loved it. We loved it here as well. And we are just so grateful to have you back again to share some more insight and your knowledge in terms of this peak time, and really just sharing your experiences and how we can learn all together. If you're all set, Dr. Blackwood, I am truly honored to welcome you back. Who will be sharing his screen. I believe I made you the host, Dr. Blackwood.
Yes,
So you should be able to
have.
share. Okay, perfect. I am super glad to introduce you once again. And he will be sharing his slides and his topic for today. It's all you, Dr. Blackwood. Thank you.
All right. So hopefully this works. Let's see. All right. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. So now that I'm host, I have all the power. I actually disabled the waiting room, so everybody should be able to come in and out. And every time people come in, it should be muted. So I think we've covered our bases. Thank you so much for having me back. I am excited to share with you because that is what I do. I'm just wired that way. I love learning, and healing is my passion, and I want everyone in the world to be healed and to understand that they are agents of their own healing. What a world we would live in if everybody knew that and could access, the gift that they are to themselves and others. That is my desire. So that's why we're talking about an antidote for hopelessness. Because if you watch news, and I do not have a steady diet of news at all, because it's just not good for my mental health. It's not good for my emotional wellness at all. But all the sources and resources are saying that anxiety and depression and mental health crises are on the rise. And on the one hand, kind of makes sense given that we are in or coming out of or back in, who knows, this pandemic. But it makes me wonder, is that really true that it's on the rise? Or are we just becoming more aware of some of the concerns that have been there for a long time? right? I was just talking to a young man yesterday who finally got to the point of seeking help, and he's talking about this intense anxiety that he's experiencing. And a question that I ask people when I start meeting with them is, how long have you been experiencing this? And his answer is quite similar to many people's: for as long as I can remember, for a very long time, right? So a lot of the concerns that really are now coming to the forefront are things that are kind of have been in motion for some time. So we're going to be talking about mental health, mental wellness today, and really focusing on how anxiety can turn over into depression, right? Because most people experience anxiety. We talked about this a little bit before. And for those of you who are new to me, Dr. Andrew Blackwood, also known as Coach Drew, I've been in the field for over 16, almost 17 years now. And as I help people understand themselves, and I help people to appreciate that the most powerful voice in the world is the one in their own heads, we want to really understand what we're saying to ourselves, the pictures that we're throwing up on the screen of our minds, because anxiety is an emotion like any other emotion. And it is a simple way of understanding anxiety is a picture of the future that is unpleasant. If you have a negative picture of the future on the screen of your mind, your body's going to react to it, because what we feel, we believe is real. Your body cannot tell the difference between present, past, future, real or not real. If you're imagining it, just like you're watching a movie with all the sound effects and everything, your body's going to start to react to it. So if you have a negative picture of the future, you're going to experience anxiety. And the problem is not so much that you experience anxiety, it's about the intensity, it's about the duration of the anxiety. And I remember my mom lived in the States for a while, and, trying to be the good son, I went to go visit her, and she was coming back to visit, and I was driving. And I don't know how it happened, but all of a sudden there is this flash tornado. Okay, a tornado is happening as we're driving. So not only is it a long drive, it's supposed to be what, an 18-hour drive. And I don't know if I am behind this tornado or if I'm in front of it. I can't tell if it's chasing me or if I'm chasing it. All I can see is just rain, torrential rain coming down. And the car is shaking because of the wind. I mean, trucks are pulling off to the side of the road. Vans are pulling off the side of the road. Cars are pulling off to the side of the road. And there's no way I'm pulling off the side of the road, because what's going to happen if I pull over the side of the road? I've got 18 hours, 16, 15 hours to go. And I don't know if this tornado is coming after me or in front of me. So I just continue to go. But let me just say this. It was horrific. Okay. It was probably the worst experience of my entire life. And I went to school in Alabama. So I did that drive regularly. But this time it was something different because of the tornado. It was a big deal. And sometimes when we experience anxiety, the situation is so big, right, that it causes us to feel a lot of anxiety. But what makes it even worse is when we get stuck, right? When we get stuck thinking, oh my God, this is never going to end. This is the way my life is going to be. Right? When we get stuck and we feel powerless in the middle of a storm like that, and we feel depressed, right? Depression typically, unlike anxiety, has a lot to do with looking back at our life and thinking about what could have been different and what wasn't. But when we get stuck and feel a sense of powerlessness, then we feel depressed, okay? So we're going to be talking about how things turn, but more importantly, we're going to be talking about how to come out of depression. But before we do, we're going to talk a little bit about our makeup and my perspective here. Okay. So this is my belief. Some people may believe differently, but I believe that, our makeup is not just our physical bodies, right? We have a spiritual component to us, right? And it's like our mind is the go-between. I would not say that our minds are just brains and just matter. I think it's like the bridge between the spiritual and the physical. There are so many things that we experience that can't be accounted for just by brain activity, right? Interesting things like, I was just thinking about you and you call me. How does that work, right? You're all the way in Japan, right? You're halfway around the world and you call me just as I'm thinking about you. That is, for me, that's a spiritual kind of thing, right? Different kind of backgrounds we will consider, different experiences as spiritual. So for me, there's that reality. And depending on who you see and who you get your information from, sometimes people will look at the whole spectrum of our experience, and other times people will focus in on particular aspects, right? So when some people think about mental health, they focus on the physical realities, right? I think it's really important to acknowledge those. One of the, outside of that, harrowing experience with tornadoes, one of the most challenging moments of my life, I spent about 18 months thinking that I was losing my mind. Okay. And this wasn't too long ago. This was a few years ago. 18 months of just suffering. Okay. And my mood was unstable. I thought I had a mood disorder. I would cry over spilt milk, literally. Literally, the milk would spill and I would cry. I was just really sensitive, and I couldn't understand what was going on for me. I was falling asleep around the wheel. I almost fell asleep with my girls in the car. I have 2 daughters, 8 and 5 now, but I almost fell asleep with them in the car. It was the worst thing ever. Come to find out that my body was reacting to gluten. Gluten, of all things. I had no idea. I had been eating wheat all my life. I don't know what happened. Maybe they changed the way they're making it, or something happened. Maybe I have leaky gut syndrome. I don't know. But when I realized that, I stopped eating gluten and my life has been different. Right. So it's important to be aware of these things and get a holistic perspective about what's happening for you or the people in your family. Right. We don't want to just focus on one area. I know it's important, and I encourage people to have a doctor that you trust, right? So they can give you insight into the medical aspects of things, because there's an overlap between, medical approach, the psychological approach, thinking about the environment. All these things make a difference, right? If your vitamin D isn't where it's supposed to be, your vitamin B isn't where it's supposed to be. Like, these are medical things but they also spill into environmental, right? What kind of food are you eating, right? Culturally, what is your diet like, right? It's important to think about genetics, right? Not just like what you may have inherited in terms of a mental component or your makeup, but also blood, your physical way of being. All these things matter. You can inherit cultural and relational practices and dynamics. All of these things matter, right? I tend to be on from the environmental and physical side up. I don't deal much with the medical. But all these other areas are areas that I really spend a lot of time focusing on. So you'll hear that influence in that perspective here. But I just want to encourage people, as you think about your experiences or the experiences of your loved ones, let's not just limit our understanding to one particular area. We want to give some thought to all the other factors as well. All right. So let's talk a little bit about an antidote. Okay. An antidote. And I have this little, natural herbal kind of picture going on in the background, because I don't want people to get upset talking about medication. Not pushing medication, but I do believe that, it can be really helpful Like I said before, diet and those things are important. But what I like about this picture is it invites us to think about all the different elements that come together so that we can respond to hopelessness, so that we can respond to anxiety, we can respond to feelings of depression, right? So if you think about the things you want to mix together, one is the power of choice, okay? Another part is healthy beliefs. Another part is awareness. Then there's balance and routine and support. Okay, so we're going to dig into these things a little bit. And if you have questions along the way, I definitely want you to take note of them because we're going to go into a time of questions afterwards. All right. Let's talk a little bit about choice. Choice is a human element, I believe, something that differentiates us from other creatures. We have choice, right? Choice is important. When we don't experience choice, we don't feel human. We feel subhuman, right? Powerlessness is one of the worst feelings to endure, as is hopelessness, right? So when I think about choice and that element of humanity, I also think that choice is really about direction. Okay, it's about a movement, gaining momentum. It's about how you invest, and it's really about trust, right? All of these things overlap because a lot of the times our choices, they're not really well-informed choices. So again, if we think about our own mental health and we think about how we've tried to address it before, if we only focus on one element or one aspect, right, then we're not going to benefit from all the possibilities and the inroads that we can make, right? Choice is important, but choice is only as good as the information that we have to make the choices with. Okay. If you do not have good information, you're probably going to be frustrated and then end up feeling stuck. And that is part of the challenge with anxiety and with depression. It gives us tunnel vision. Okay. We get stuck on particular things and particular perspectives, right? Which is why it's really important to be talking to people who are outside of your situation, right? Because then they can give you an informed perspective. That's really important. So when I think about choice and I think about direction, it's not so much about knowing everything before you make a choice. It's about knowing the direction that you want to go in. And it's about not being stuck. We want to be able to make choices because that helps us make movements. It helps us to take the next step. And then when you take the next step, you can start to experience momentum. Every choice we make is an investment. Okay. It's an investment. And it's important to see it that way, because if we don't make choices, that in and of itself is a choice, right? Then we stay right where we are. And if we do make choices, but they're not the healthiest choices, that's going to lead us in a particular way and lead to a particular outcome. So it's important to have informed choices. Now, excuse me, our choices are informed by a degree of awareness, okay, of our beliefs and our perspectives. They shape our choices, okay? Our beliefs, they can start small, but they grow and they have an echoing effect throughout our minds and our lives, okay? Our beliefs are important. And virtually everyone I help understand themselves better, we start to talk about beliefs, where they come from and how they're built. So let's talk a little bit about beliefs and perspectives, because it's important to see that this cycle. Your belief is going to inform your perspective, and your perspective is going to inform your beliefs, okay? When we're looking at this picture here, let's go back to choice for a moment. Do you see this maze here? Like, life can be really confusing sometimes, right? Sometimes we will find ourselves in situations where we don't know what to do, don't know where to go. And this is where beliefs really come into play. Because I want you to give some thought to this. If someone believes that they are capable and that they can handle the situation, can you see how that would inform their perspective? If somebody sees every challenge as embedded or inherent within every challenge is an opportunity, it's going to shape the way that they engage with that situation, right? You don't just see the challenge when you believe, when your perspective is that, you know what, there's something good here for me. There's something where I can grow. Your beliefs are going to have an incredible impact on your mental health, right? It's a really cyclical kind of thing. So if you are feeling stuck, like many people do feel stuck, it's important that we don't attribute that stuckness to the situation. It has more to do with how you're thinking in and about the situation. The many people that I've talked to after they've attempted to end their lives, there's a common way of thinking, okay? There's a common pattern of thought. It's all or nothing, right? That's just one of them. That's one of the ways of thinking. I can't do this. It's not going to be different. What's the point? They might say many different things, but at the core of it is that same pattern. That same pattern of all or nothing thinking. If we're not aware of these patterns and they continue to echo throughout our lives, it's going to reinforce these experiences. But again, I don't want people to think that it's just about thoughts. That is a significant part of the equation, one that we actually have the most control over, but it's important to think about other factors as well. I'll share an experience that I even had, was yesterday. I don't know about where you are in the world or if when you're watching this video, but it's April now and it just snowed. It just snowed, like there was snow on the ground, there was snow in the trees. I didn't take down my Christmas lights and I was thinking about just turning them on again, just because there was that much snow. And how that impacted me is the barometric pressure. Whenever it goes from hot to cold or cold to colder, or when it jumps in several degrees, I feel the change. I used to get headaches, but I don't get headaches now. Now I get sleepy. Like literally, I get really, really sleepy. It's a thing, but my mood also can get really, it can get really low, right? Seasonal affective disorder, sad, that people talk about. Some people get sad in the summer, right? Everybody's body may be a little bit different. So it's important to consider these other factors. But I like to focus on beliefs because there are patterns to our thoughts. And when we understand the patterns, then we can actually work on shifting things, right? So understanding our beliefs are really, really important. Now, when I talked about hope and trust, there's an element of trust that I think is really important. This is where it gets into the spiritual domain, because I believe there are some realities about our lives that aren't explained by, I don't know, modern or Western medicine or particular beliefs. The reality is there are so many things about our lives that are important to us, that really contribute to how we function. And it's good to be aware of these and thinking about these things. And there are three core needs that I experience for myself as a person, but when I work with people, I think about these things as well. We have a need for safety, which I think everybody gets, right? When we don't have our physical needs met, or even when we're not feeling emotionally safe, then there's a degree of anxiety that comes along with that, right? Then everybody wants to be significant, right? And I mean, there's a difference between being famous and being significant. Sometimes we think the two are the same. So everybody wants to be seen and known, but at the core of that, it's the knowing part. They want to know that they matter. And when we have experiences in our lives that communicate to us that we don't matter, then that impacts our sense of self, right? That causes us to feel vulnerable and even unsafe, right? Strength. that has everything to do with power and control, right? I can impact change in my situation and lives of others. My choice matters. It makes a difference. When we don't have a sense of strength and feel empowered, then we feel powerless. We feel helpless. We feel hopeless, which is a lot of what was happening when everything changed for people around the world. I was talking to people who were doing relatively well in their lives, and then the pandemic hit, and then the undercurrent of anxiety kind of really bubbled up for them because they came face to face with the fact that the things that I've been working towards, they're not guaranteed, and they can be taken from me just like that. It's a reality that we're not in control of many of the things that we think that we are. A lot of the times we might rely on our job or rely on our family members, but they could actually be gone tomorrow. There is a reality about the lack of control and the lack of permanence that we have in this world. So my encouragement to you, if you do not have a spiritual openness or a faith or something that moves beyond just the temporal, it's important to give that some thought. I find a lot of psychological, emotional, spiritual comfort in believing in God, right? And that actually really does help me, because more than what I look at in the temporal sense is this idea of communion and listening and praying. And when those things seem out of control, I get a sense that God is watching out for me and he's going to take care of me. And I do believe in life beyond this life, right? So our belief systems, they matter, okay? They make a difference. And I do believe that's part of our makeup as well. So when we come face to face with these really core needs, sometimes it's hard to reconcile that, right? It invites us, again, it's an invitation. This is not necessarily a burden, it's challenging, but it's an invitation to look beyond just the temporal, beyond just what we see. So it's important to give that some thought as well. So I want to double back to awareness, okay, and really circle back on how this really makes a difference. When I think about awareness, this image here, I was introduced to this idea when I was studying, I guess that would have been like 20 years ago, but it really illustrates that what you see isn't necessarily what you get. There's a whole lot more to us, more than meets the eye, because on the surface, we're like, okay, this is what's going on. But beneath the iceberg here that we see on the top, there's a whole lot that's happening for us. Right? There's a whole lot that's happening for us. Every day we're thinking, every day we're feeling. And just because we are not necessarily consciously aware of something doesn't mean that there aren't thoughts and feelings and more to that point, images that are running in the back of our minds constantly. And our bodies hold on to those feelings and that energy, right? So when I pick up my daughters after school, I take the time and I want to talk to them. I want to understand what's going on. How was their day? You don't look, the way you did yesterday. You don't seem as happy. What's going on for you? Because if I don't ask, it doesn't mean that it didn't happen. And at that age, they're not really processing things. So when we talk through them, we understand, oh, this happened. And how did you feel when that happened? Okay, really? So what can you do about that? Right? What do you want to do about that? Believe it or not, my hope is really prevention, okay? My hope is to help people understand how these things work so that you can address these things before they start building, right? We can address them after. However, it's more important to really be aware of what's happening. So by simply asking a question like that, so what do you want to do about that, right? Do you see how that sows the seed of awareness of choice and power? Because a lot of the times we just accept things. It just happened. That's the way it is. That's the way life is. That's a belief. And every time we repeat that, it goes deeper and gets stronger. right? A belief is an idea that's been repeated over time. Anything you repeat over and over and over, it's going to become a belief. So we have the opportunity by exploring these things to actually plant some really good ideas and to kind of process things. So one of the ways that I encourage people to process things is through journaling. A lot of the times we want to feel better, but we don't appreciate that feeling better is directly related to thinking better. Okay. You might be able to experience change when you behave differently, but like that maze, life happens. And sometimes we find ourselves in situations, again, if not the exact same situation, a very similar one, right? Can anybody relate to that? Have you ever asked yourself, how did I end up here again? Like, oh my goodness, what's going on? I thought I dealt with that, right? It's so important to increase our awareness, and that's what journaling is really about. I won't do it now, but I'll send you all a link so that you can access a journaling resource, My Gift to You, on a platform. I don't want to do it now because then it will take me out of the presentation and I might not be able to find it in time. But yeah, journaling is definitely something that I encourage people to do. And it's not just kind of writing about your day's events. There's different ways you can use it. You can journal about gratitude, which is great. And I encourage people to do what I call the ATI process, where you become aware of what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and then you learn to tolerate those things. Because only when you can tolerate what you're feeling are you able to then be intentional with what you're thinking. These are all connected. However, there's an order to it and a process that's really, that's really important for us to be aware of. So I was talking to someone actually before I jumped on this call with you all, and we were just looking at her life history as we kind of process the experience that she's had. So I'm encouraging her to journal the same way that I'm encouraging everybody to journal. But when we look for resolution for the things that we've experienced, it's important that we know what we're doing, right? So that those things don't just sit with us. We want to be aware of how to move through a process. So journaling is really, really important. It helps us to be aware. Okay, now let's talk about another element. Balance. Balance is so important. And, I used to think about balance as finding, this even place. And I realized that just doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. It's not about 50% of this and 50% of that. Because if your life is anything like mine, there are so many different parts and pieces. Balance is about coordination, right? Remember all of those elements of our humanity that I was talking about along that spectrum of how we process and how we live our lives. It's really critical that we make room for all of these pieces. We learn how to be adaptable. We learn how to juggle the parts of our lives, right? I know for me, motion, movement, music, like if you want to shift my mood, or when I'm ready to shift my mood, that's what I now that it's warm, I get out there, I go walking, right? It makes such a difference. The fresh air, the movement, my blood is flowing. I'm listening to music that I enjoy, lifts my spirit. It makes a difference. If I do not make time for that, then things are going to be out of whack for me, right? So our mental health, our spiritual health, our physical wellness, it's all connected, right? So it's not about fixing things so that they never get out of balance. Life happens. You lose your balance, but then you find your balance again. So that's really, really important. Now, I intentionally want to save some time for some questions today because that's my favorite part. So I'm going to get to the next one real quickly. Routine. Routine is really, really important. And it may sound a little bit Like it's contradicting what I was saying about the flexibility and the importance of being adaptable in life. Yeah, both are very important. It's important to have a routine. And then when things kind of step out of routine, we're flexible and adaptable enough to deal with it and then return or integrate new changes into our routines. That's really, 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 really important. One of the biggest impacts that a young man had, one of the biggest impacts that was had in this young man's life several years back was him getting a personal trainer. That made such a difference for him. He was depressed, right? But getting out on a regular basis, getting that exercise made a big difference for him. Then he was better able to deal with the thoughts and put some things in practice. So one of the thought patterns that, again, permeates significant experiences of depression and anxiety is all or nothing thinking, right? Sometimes it's very difficult for us to take that next step because we don't value the individual steps. We want the whole journey to be done, right? If we're not going to be top of the class, then there's no point. Or if I don't lose all the weight this week, then there's no point, right? There's a way of thinking that's not helpful. We do want to embrace the reality that we will go the distance only if we take the next step and the next step and the next step and the next step. And routine is what helps us to take the next step, even when we don't think we're making progress. Even when you're parenting a child who doesn't seem like they're listening to you, you take the next step and the next step and the next step, right? You do what it takes to keep moving in a direction of health. Now, my alarm just went off. Why did my alarm go off? Because I've set alarms to help me have a routine. I set alarms to remind me what to think about, right? I set alarms to remind me, be gentle, be patient, especially during stressful times, right? There's routines in our lives and we develop a sense of normalcy, right? Because the opposite happens when we don't. We think that we're not in a routine because the routine isn't good. But the truth is, we're all in routines. I was talking to a lady last week and she was just saying, I'm just not a disciplined person. I'm so not disciplined, right? I never finish things that I start. This is what she's saying about herself. And maybe you can relate to that. But I'm listening to her and not only is that all or nothing thinking, but that sounds like consistency to me. The fact that you never finish what you start, that's consistency. That sounds like you're very disciplined at not finishing what you start. You're very disciplined at changing from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next, right? When we create routines, it's an opportunity for us to be intentional. And eventually those routines become normal, right? They become habits, right? The best way to get rid of a bad habit is by creating a new one, integrating it into a routine. Okay, so that's important. Can you see how the thought patterns and the behaviors really connect, right? When we have patterned ways of thinking that are healthy, we have patterned behaviors, and those behaviors then enrich our lives. Even thinking about gratitude on a regular basis, it opens our perspective up to all that there is to be grateful for. When we were locked indoors for a while at the beginning of the pandemic, I forgot that I could go outside. I forgot that I could go out for a walk. My whole world was just kind of in this box. And when I started to go out for a walk, I was just like, oh my goodness, it's so beautiful out here. I have the freedom, I have the ability to walk, and I felt so free. And that informed how I was living, right? So it may seem simple, but having healthy routines is one of the best and most significant ways to impact hopelessness, right? To impact anxiety, to shift away from hopelessness and anxiety to having courage and a good sense of calm, okay? And the last thing I'll say, which is a good antidote, part of the antidote, part of the mix, is support. We are not meant to do life alone. We are not meant to do life alone. And there are so many things that happen in our lives that make it challenging for us to trust. And like I said before, when we face challenges, if we see them as opportunities, it shifts things for us. So we have lots of opportunities to do things differently, to trust, to try something new, right? To think about something in a different way. And sometimes having someone along for the journey who doesn't necessarily see everything the same way that you do is actually helpful. Or someone who's a couple steps ahead of you, that can be helpful, right? We are not meant to do life alone. And a lot of the times what we know as stigma is actually anxiety, right? We're so afraid of being embarrassed. We're so afraid of feeling that sense of shame that we don't take that step and acknowledge the opportunity for change. We don't acknowledge a challenge. We don't acknowledge a problem that's been around for a long time. Problems don't go away on their own for the most part, right? We tend to cope with them. But as we talked about in one of our previous sessions, coping is not change, right? Healthy coping can sometimes lead to change, but coping becomes change where there's a degree of awareness, like we've talked about before. But then there is growth, there is intentionality, there is routine, right? All these things make coping strategies, healthy coping strategies, lead into change. Sometimes we cope with work, we cope with, sometimes we can even cope with change, we can cope with prayer. But if there isn't growth woven into that, then we're not really addressing the underlying challenges, okay? We're not meant to do life alone. So remember, you are not on your own. There are people out there who can and will help, okay? So just by way of review, they're an antidote to the kind of hopelessness that we experience, especially when we've been anxious and we have unaddressed things and unaddressed concerns that roll over into feeling stuck and feeling depressed. What we want to be able to do is recognize that we have choice. We have choice. We want to be aware of the things that we choose to believe. We want to increase our awareness of things that we didn't even intentionally believe, but that we believe now, right? We want to increase our awareness. One of the ways to do that is journaling. Okay. We want to find balance, a balanced perspective, but also a balanced investment. Are we moving? Are we eating well? Right? Are we even going to the bathroom well? That's important. Do I need medical support? Right? Am I attending to my spiritual life well enough? Am I connecting with healthy people? Are my relationships balanced and healthy? Right? We make those choices and then we incorporate these things into a routine. Right? We make these things regular so that we can take continual steps in the direction that we want to go in. Without movement, there can be no momentum, right? So when we want to go the distance, we want to have a routine, we want to build habits and then build momentum. And yes, we might lose balance, but then we kind of learn to juggle and bring things back in. And lastly, we're not meant to do life alone. And there are wonderful people out there who are ready and willing to help. All right. I know I've said a whole lot, so I'm going to end this and open up the chat. And before I do, I'm going to throw this link in here for everybody in the meeting so that if you are interested in journaling and learning how I journal, you're welcome to click on that and enroll, and you'll see that you are able to access this content for free. All right. There we go. Perfect, perfect, perfect. All right. So now it's a good time for some questions. You're welcome to raise your hand or type something in the chat. And you're also, if you don't want everyone to see it, I believe you are able to message me privately. Okay, so those are options. Now, one of the questions that I get as everybody's kind of thinking through, if there's something that you wanted me to elaborate on or share more about, please let me know. One of the questions that I often get is, you know, where do these thoughts come from? Why do I think this way? And I don't have a 100% answer, but I think when we start to open our minds to, that question, there are several factors that contribute to our thought patterns and how we think, right? Sometimes it's as a result of life experiences, right? Life experiences can set the tone for our belief systems. So if something tragic happens to us, then sometimes we start to think, okay, tragic things are going to happen, right? So you start to anticipate these things. You start to expect them, right? So that's one source. Another source is culture and media, right? Those things can put images in our minds and scenarios in our minds that we never really considered, but now we know it's possible. And then sometimes if we think that something's possible, sometimes we start to think about it as if it's likely or imminent, right? And then we can get into these thought patterns. What if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? And some of us are more prone to those anxiety inducing thought patterns. Maybe it's genetics, maybe it's life experiences, maybe it's all of the above. But sometimes our thoughts come from those kinds of things, and other times they can be spiritually influenced, I believe, as well, right? So there are lots of things that I don't fully understand. However, regardless of where they do come from, it's important for us to be aware that we do have choice, right? And the more we exercise that choice, it's the more we build the skill, right? You cannot change something that you're not aware of. When you're aware of the thought pattern, you're like, oh, I'm using that thought pattern, I can respond to it, right? It's our responsibility to manage our own thoughts. That's nobody else's job, right? If you're not skillful at managing your own thoughts, it's your opportunity to do that. You want to be response able. You might not be in control of what comes into your mind, but you do want to be able to respond to it, be response able, okay? So there's a couple questions here. How would you keep up with a routine when you have a bad environment, like that's not supportive, especially from family? That's a good question. So remember, we want to own this beauty of choice, okay? Sometimes one of the biggest impacts of anxiety, like I said before, or thoughts that lead towards depression is we get tunnel vision and we don't realize that we have options. We are creative beings. Somehow we got some device to take us to the moon. Okay, we have devices where we can see people on the other side of the earth, right? It's important for us to cultivate our own creativity and think about options that we have, right? I don't know all the particulars for your situation. So I can't really give you specifics, but what I do think is important is if you take the time to just brainstorm, right? Brainstorm what options you have, what avenues do you have? When are you not necessarily in the company of these family members? Or sometimes family members, even with the most unhealthy habits from my perspective, they do have some good habits too, right? They do have some good desires too. So sometimes we can do a mix of things, do things with people, or do things when they're not present. So just take some time to brainstorm some things. And if I can be of support, by all means, just shoot me an email. We can connect for a consultation free of charge, and I can answer more specifically. But I'll definitely say, look for opportunities both within and without, beyond that particular environment, so that you can see what you can do for yourself, right? So good question. How do I diagnose emotional unsafety in myself? Um, Emotional unsafety. Well, I guess if there's degrees to risk and safety, right? There's the end of, taking your life, being ready to do that. That's one situation. And then little less on the extreme is self-harm, right? And that can look like many different forms. That could be, self-harm, like cutting yourself, burning yourself, pulling your hair, or it could be consenting to relationships that aren't healthy for you, right? That could be coping with unhealthy practices, right? There's a whole degree. So one of the best ways to diagnose or look at your life is to think about what you actually want, right? What do you actually want for yourself? And I've never met anybody who actually wants to suffer or who actually wants to experience emotional pain. And those who do, there's a belief system that, they deserve it or they feel guilty, right? So it's important to look at what you want with and from your life. And the more you see what it is that you want, is the more you're going to move towards it. So as opposed to measuring, because I think emotional unsafety is pretty obvious, but another way to look at it is, what is it that I really want? And what choices am I making that are moving me in the opposite direction? And then you can figure out, okay, what's happening here? What's moving me to make these kinds of decisions over and over and over again? So I hope that answers the question. If you have a follow-up one, or I can add more clarity, we definitely have some time. Okay, so somebody was asking to talk a little bit more about the subconscious. So, so a simple way to understand this, in my way of thinking about it, is basically awareness. Okay, awareness. Are we aware of what we are thinking? Okay, if we're not aware, then it's an opportunity to stop. And I guess it's probably leads into the next question here: how can one truly slow the mind? So it's important to be able to stop and pay attention. And if we are really busy, if we have a busy life, if we have a busy mind, then we don't really stop to consider what may be fueling our thoughts and our emotions, right? So my go-to is journaling. That's definitely something that helps to slow the mind for a couple reasons. One, your hand can't go as fast as your thoughts can. So it literally invites you to slow down. And what's good about it is you can actually review and you can actually come back to it. Sometimes I list a number of thoughts or topics that are on my mind, and then I can go back and look at each one. And then on top of that, I use a system after I've journaled. It's part of my devotional life, where every 7 days, like the seventh day is a review. So I go back and I look at my entries for the whole week, right? And there's a lot of great stuff that I want to internalize, right? So it's interesting that if you see your mind like that iceberg, we want to somehow allow more of that stuff to come to the top. So we want to reflect more, we want to ask ourselves good questions, right? Increase our awareness, but also ask ourselves good questions. Now, this way of asking questions is helpful for ourselves and when we engage with other people. We want to avoid using the word why, because some people are not as sensitive to it, but sometimes it kind of suggests, well, it embodies this idea that you're doing something wrong. Like, why do I think this way? And it's an implied statement, right? Like, what's wrong with me? Something's wrong with me. And it really doesn't get to the heart of the question, right? It imposes judgment and value as opposed to saying, well, what's contributing to these thoughts, right? One personalizes it and causes you to think that something's wrong with you, whereas another, it actually voices a genuine question that leads you to think more. Well, what contributes to this? Well, what contributes to that? So I was talking to a lady today, and she's in her 60s. And there are many things in her life that she carried with her and had no resolution for, right? They were sources of anxiety for all these years, and there's been no resolution, right? So when she now starts to think about, moments that she's had, we start to walk through a process. So we look at the fact, okay? Events are factual, they happen. But then we want to look at what was the impact of this event, okay? How did this event impact me, right? When we start to look at impact, we start to enter the territory of grief and loss because we have expectations, right? We have expectations of our parents. We have expectations of the world, our teachers. And a lot of the times they don't meet that. And a lot of the times they do the opposite. The people who hurt us the most were the least we expected, the least likely person we expected to hurt us. And that reality is a loss for us. It's important that we acknowledge the impact. It's important that we grieve the loss. If we don't do that, on some level, yes, we cope and we limp along, but it doesn't give us resolution. It doesn't really bring about healing. On some level, it actually conveys that it wasn't that important. And part of us is at conflict with that because we know this just wasn't right. Right? We know it's important, but when we don't address it, it causes us to think that, it didn't really matter. And we will never really consent to that. I don't believe anyways. So when we slow the mind and we become aware, we start to move through this process. We look at the fact, we look at the impact, and then we want to look at what did I believe as a result of this? What did I believe about me? What did I believe about the world? Right? Because then we start to look at our choices over the years and be like, oh, well, that came from that. Oh, well, that makes sense. Right. And in a couple weeks back, we talked about trauma and the impact of trauma. And one of the impacts that trauma has on us is it presses pause on our emotional development. So you can be 45, you can be 60, you could be 70, and a part of you is still 7 or 5. And you think about life in that domain from that vantage point. When we revisit these things, we acknowledge the loss, we can say, okay, this is what I came to believe. What caused me to believe that? Well, why did I interpret it that way? Well, because I was 7. Well, that kind of makes sense, right? I believed I was stupid because somebody who was older than me and smarter than me told me that I was. So I just took their word for it. Right? But then you can realize, oh, okay, well, it makes sense that I would come to that conclusion, but is it true? When we think about that verse, that truth, like truth makes us free. Right? When we start to realize, oh, the stuff that I'm believing and living by isn't true, then you're now free to use that choice that we talked about earlier, to use your capacity to live differently, to live the life that you've been given to live, right? So that whole idea of the subconscious is let's just become more aware of what we actually are thinking, right? And how we feel, okay? All right, so another question. I love this question. How do I deal with anger and resentment as a result of trauma and the reality of not being able to move on? Okay, so first of all, thank you for this wonderful question. And I will interject a question here. The reality of not being able to move on, is it a reality that any of us are not able to move on, right? Does that mean it's not possible to move on? This is a good thing to kind of reflect on, because it might be an all or nothing way of thinking about your situation. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a moment. But how do I deal with anger and resentment? So whenever I hear people talk about anger, number one, it's important to really understand what other emotions are attached to it. Because a lot of the times, beneath and around anger are other things as well, like sadness and hurt, right? It's important to acknowledge these things. And it's usually easier to acknowledge anger because it makes us feel stronger, right? It activates us to do something. You feel that strength. Whereas when we feel sad or we feel hurt and we acknowledge that, then we feel more vulnerable. But it's important to have safe enough space with yourself or support to go there, to look at the hurt, right? And so that we can manage the anger. And I don't want to convey that anger is bad or that it's wrong to feel angry. I think it's healthy to feel angry. And if you come from a biblical worldview, there's evidence that, it says be angry and sin not. Just because you're angry doesn't mean you have to go and do all these horrible things, right? It's important to acknowledge when there is injustice, and that can make us feel angry. When things are not fair, yes, we're going to feel angry, but we can be intentional about how we deal with those emotions. So when I think about resentment, when we are disappointed or when our desires aren't met, we feel disappointed. When we have expectations and those expectations aren't met, that's when we feel resentment. Okay. So if we want to deal with resentment, we can work our way backwards. We can look at the expectations. What expectations did I have that were not met or are not being met? Right. And I know there's so many different contexts that we could look at. So I'll answer it generally, but if you have a more specific area to inquire about, let me know. But if we trace it backwards from resentment to expectations, we can start to look at, okay, what expectations that I have? And, there's a difference between a desire and an expectation. And it's important to know the difference between the two. We can desire anything we want. There's nothing wrong with a desire, from my perspective anyways. Like, I could want to eat 5-10 bags of chips back to back because I love chips. I'm not sweet. I'm a salt guy. Like, I would love to eat chips. But if I expect myself to eat chips bag after bag after bag and expect nothing to happen to me, that's just like, that's not a good look. It's not going to work out well for me because my expectation is actually unhealthy. So when we can want whatever we want, but whenever it rolls over into an expectation, this idea that this should happen or this is right to happen, right? That's what an expectation is. It has beliefs and values attached to it. It's important for us to think about whether this is healthy or unhealthy. So here are some of the markers of a healthy versus unhealthy expectation. Number one, is it clear? Is the expectation clear to you, to the other person? Like, can you write it out? You know what the expectation is. You know, I expect you to be home by 9 p.m. every night because you're my husband or you're my wife or you're my teenage son who 9 o'clock is the time. Okay. When it's explicit and clear, then you can say, is there agreement on this? If there's no agreement, it's not going to be a healthy expectation. It might be an assumption. And a lot of the times we assume because I think something that the other person should think the same thing or should think the same way. That's just not how life works. We are two different people. We will not see everything the same way. We can come to an agreement, but to expect or assume that somebody's going to think the way that you do is just setting yourself up for resentment and disappointment. So is it clear? Is it explicit? And is it agreed upon? That's important. Another element of healthy versus unhealthy expectations is when would we say is it realistic? Is the expectation realistic? Because sometimes expectations, they're just not. They're desires. I would love for me and my wife to be on the same page all the time about everything. You know, a lot of people, and they think a good sign of a good relationship is when, you know what, you can finish my sentences. You know what I'm thinking. I don't have to tell you what I want for my birthday. You know. No, that doesn't usually work very well or for very long. Again, because you're two different people. It's just not realistic. You can desire it, you can want it as much as you want, but it doesn't make it realistic, right? So you want to ask, is my expectation realistic, right? Can somebody live up to that? And then is it fair and appropriate? Not fair and appropriate for you, but fair and appropriate for this person in their particular context, in their particular life experience or development, right? Just because it's fair and doable for you doesn't mean it's fair and doable for somebody else. So it's important when you think about your expectations, right? Are they realistic? Are they developmentally appropriate? Especially as we look at our children, and every child is different. So one 14-year-old may be very responsible, whereas another one, not so much. And there may be reasons that contributed to his lack of or her lack of responsibility, right? Response-able. He's not as able to respond in this particular situation because of these things. And there's a difference between an excuse and an explanation, okay? An excuse, it kind of just says, okay, fine, that's how you are. Okay, I'll just accept it. Whereas an explanation, it's more about understanding and empathy. And then we can approach the situation. How do we help build this person's capacity if possible, right? So all of that ties into expectations, whether they're healthy or unhealthy. So if there's resentment, there's likely expectation. So it's good to say, okay, is this a desire or is this an expectation? And is it healthy or unhealthy? Okay. So thank you for the question. It was a really, really good question. Let me scroll through the screen here. Having trouble changing over. Are there any hands that I might have missed? This is odd. I'm having trouble changing my screen here. Okay, well, you know, I'm going to assume that there aren't. This is so strange. Okay, maybe because everybody's on the same screen. That's probably why. Okay. Any other questions at this point? Now, what I'm going to do as well is I'm going to throw my email into the chat here so that people can take that down, because sometimes people are hesitant to ask a question in somewhat of a public forum. So you're welcome to shoot me an email if you'd like. But we've still got a few minutes left to our time. So, I mean, I don't want to hold anybody up. So if there aren't any more questions, can we access these sessions and where? If yes, good question. Yeah, maybe our lovely host can speak to that. And I guess I have a question for you all as well. Are there topics within the mental health relational arena that you would like to have covered that we haven't talked about yet? Because I definitely want to be able to offer support that is relevant to you. So you can give that some thought while our lovely host addresses the question about accessing these sessions.
Yes, first of all, thank you, Dr. Blackwood, for a really interesting but also very meaningful and knowledgeable with your expertise in terms of really helping us and really providing really good insight and knowledge. So firstly, thank you so much. In regards to the question about accessing support, was this in regards to receiving access to Dr. Blackwood or in regards to other programs? I just wanted to clarify.
It's a good question. And while this person responds, I think it's worthwhile to look at a number of different options here. So can people access these sessions that we've already had?
I see. Yes, sorry to interrupt. In terms of the recorded sessions, we have recorded one previously as well with Dr. Blackwood in regards to the topic of the 3 ways, I believe, to heal, if I'm not mistaken. So we do have that recorded session and we are currently recording this one as well. So I believe we will upload them on YouTube. For those that were not able to come today, and for those that also want to, review back and, really go along and see these with us as well as the previous ones. So we will for sure be providing that on YouTube. In regards to anyone who also would like to personally reach out to Dr. Blackwood, please feel free to call the organization or message us. We will provide your name and your number, and we will be the ones to pass it along to Dr. Blackwood. That way it'll just be more organized, and that way we will be able to relay the people that really would like to speak with Dr. Blackwood in an appropriate manner. So after the session or any other day, feel free to give us a call or email us, and we will be able to record your name and emails and pass it forward to Dr. Blackwood. So I hope I answered these questions to the best of my ability. If anyone else has any other questions, feel free to drop it in the chat or give us a call, and we will for sure be able to answer to the best of our ability as well.
Excellent. Thank you. And yes, Selena, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, thank you for that. I've taken note about grief and loss, as well as forgiveness and moving on. So if there's anybody else who's interested in that, you can throw in the chat, me too, or just raise your hand, or I definitely, because I love talking about that. Okay, yeah. Okay, so there's a echoed sentiment there. Excellent.
All right. Believe if there are any remaining questions for Dr. Blackwood or for myself, feel free to drop it in the chat or unmute yourself if you have any questions. We would love to hear.
Okay, that's a good question. How do I know I have healed? We've got 13 minutes. I mean, I could really comment on these now if you guys would like, and then if there's more, we can kind of double back, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. So one moment, because my family is playing music and oh, okay, it stopped. Great. Okay, so grief and loss, I started to touch on it earlier today with respect to seeking resolution, right? Because with grief and loss, there definitely is a journey that we're moving through. I do believe it's important to grow through grief, grow through our grieving. And at the end of it, there is a degree of healing that I believe is available for us. So we'll answer that question, how do I know I have healed? So in addition to acknowledging, our loss, because loss is so very personal. It is so unique. Two different families can lose a dog, and each person in that family may feel differently, right? For some person, they might have lost their protection for their home, and for another person, they might have lost their best friend, right? So it's important to know and to think about what this loss means to you, right? So similar to the impact, how is my life different now that I've lost this? How is life changed for me? It's important to really articulate that for yourself as an individual, right? So that has a lot to do with grief and loss. And what's interesting about grief and loss is there are different phases that we'll go through, right? Depending on the loss and the intensity of it, there may be shock. It may be traumatic, the loss, right? There's different kinds of loss. You could be grieving for years as you watch the demise or the deterioration of someone with dementia or cancer, or it could be a sudden loss, right? It could be the loss of a job. It could be the loss of a limb, right? It could have been something that just happened out of the blue, or it could have been something that somebody did, like a car accident, or someone who was unfaithful in a relationship. There are all these different dynamics, and the impact can be very different, right? So when we think about the loss and we start to breathe and get through and learn to tolerate, like I said, as you journal, you learn to tolerate those intense emotions so that you can be aware of the thoughts, and then you can be intentional. That's definitely part of the process as well. But then you move on to seeing not only how has my life changed, but not what do I want life to be like? Where do I go from here? And this is sometimes where grief and forgiveness, there can be a parallel process, but they kind of deviate a little bit. So it's important to think about, I believe, purpose, because a lot of the times when we experience great loss, or when we're reconciling, things that have happened to us, we often feel at a loss for a future that we anticipated, something that we wanted, something that we thought we would live to see and experience. And sometimes that's really the hardest part, accepting that I will not be able to do this. I will never have this again, right? And it's important to do that. It's important to look at that. And in time and in a healthy process, then we can transition to, and I still have this, and I still am able to do this. this has birthed something new in my life, or this has put me in touch with something that I've always wanted to do or experience. There is more, there is life after loss. And sometimes these words are insensitive if the timing is wrong, right? If it's too soon, you might want to punch me in the face, talk about what do you mean there's life after loss? You don't know what I've been through. You're right, I don't. Right. So the timing is probably bad, but it doesn't make it any less true. And it's important that we get to that point that we can say, okay, where there, I still am alive. I still have hope. I still have promises, right? When we start to see what you still have and we start to anticipate good and we start to experience joy, those are examples that we are healing and we are experiencing more life, new life, because there is life after loss. So that is important. Now, I definitely want to address forgiveness and healing because it can be a little bit complicated. I talk about it in my book, The Art of a Genuine Apology. In chapter 7, I talk about the connections between forgiveness and an apology and reconciliation. Those three things are very different. So a lot of people think if if I if I still hurt, then I have not healed and I haven't forgiven. And I don't know if that's true. I like to see it this way. There's a difference between being stuck in hurt and then being triggered or invited to forgive again or invited to look deeper, right? Because sometimes we do, it's like a wound. You get a wound and it's sensitive. And depending on how much time has passed, if somebody brushes up on this part that's hurt you, then it's going to hurt again, right? Or if it's a scab and somebody peels it off, right? That area of your life is going to be more sensitive than this area, right? So to expect it to never hurt again, that's a little unfair. It might be even a little unrealistic. So just because it's hurting doesn't mean that you haven't forgiven. It might be an invitation to look and address it at a deeper level, which is a good thing, right? So that's very different when you're hurting to say, okay, let me look at my hurt versus when you want somebody to suffer and you want to punish them. That's an indication that there's more room for healing and whether it's grieving and forgiveness, because when we struggle to release what has happened to us or what other people have done to us, we actually struggle to move into this beautiful life that is available to us, right? It's very hard to be looking back at something and seeing where you're going, right? If you're holding on to something that's back there, you're stopping yourself from moving forward. So when we want people to suffer, sometimes it has to do with the injustice. It has to do with the lack of their acknowledgement. But ultimately, we don't need them to be punished. We don't need them to acknowledge in order for us to be free and have a good life. If we believe that, then we're going to be stuck and attached to them, right? But just because you forgive and you release them and you set yourself free does not mean that you have to be reconciled to them. Okay, a lot of people think that forgiveness and reconciliation are the two. Well, and people might impose that on you. Well, if you forgive me, then why can't we just move forward as, you know, as it always has been? Or why do you keep bringing it up? Because I don't trust you. Plain and simple. I don't trust you. That's why we're not moving forward, right? If the person, reconciliation is different than forgiveness, because forgiveness only needs one person. I don't need your cooperation. I don't need anybody's permission to forgive, right? However, if you and I are going to move forward in a healthy and healing way, remember those expectations we talked about? We get to have agreement on that. If you don't agree to make these changes, if you don't agree to look at what moved you to do this in the first place, if you don't look at healing and support and resolution for yourself, what assurances do I have that you're not going to do this thing again? You have none, right? So somebody's promise is very different than somebody's performance. Okay. There's a difference between being desirous for reconciliation and ready for reconciliation. If somebody's ready for reconciliation, they will take the initiative. They won't be pointing fingers. They will look at themselves. They will do the work to say, this is what I'm responsible for. This is what I'm going to do differently. They will do the work. And if they don't know how to do the work, they will ask, what can I do? Not what do I have to do to make you change your mind? No, what can I do to help you feel safe to move forward? Right? Very different. And then I'm seeing that happen right now because someone was in a relationship and she's like, I really believe this guy, she sees the good in him. I'm like, well, is he showing these signs? Is he ready for change? Not just desirous, but is he ready? And sure enough, he started to take all these steps. He started to do it with no conditions. He started to look into how he could be better as a person, taking responsibility. Those are some healthy signs. So if you don't see the signs, don't assume that the person is ready for reconciliation. Don't just jump back in and expecting change when there is no understanding. And all that we do, it's important for us to get understanding, to increase wisdom, right? There's safety in the presence of many counselors. Where there's wisdom, there is great safety. So we want that in our relationships, because if you do not have a safe and healthy relationship, you are really determining the level of functioning that you have in your own personal life as well, right? Your mental health, your spiritual wellness, your physical health, that's going to be impacted by the people that you allow into your life. So if somebody is at a 2 in terms of their own health and investment in their growth and development, and you're an 8, it's probably not a good match. It's probably not, right? So it's important for us to be aware of that. Okay. So yes, so indications that you've been healed. Yes, you're seeing growth. You're getting clarity about what you want. Your level and sense of self and esteem is increasing, right? Yes, you may feel pain when you look back, but it doesn't stop you from being the person that you want to be. You're not invested in people suffering, right? You're not trying to punish people, right? You're not continually finding yourself in that same situation again with the same people or similar kind of things. That's an indication for more room for healing as well. Okay. So I know I kind of just spat a lot out of there about those topics, but I love talking about those things. So if there's more questions that you have, by all means, let me know, and I'll be glad to share some of my experiences about these topics. All right. All right, it is now 7:01, so I'm not going to hold everybody up. You're so welcome, Selena. You're so welcome. Thank you for your time and your attention, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
I don't know what this meeting.
All right, thank you so much for everyone that was able to attend today. We really appreciate all of your time spending it here with Dr. Blackwood on this great evening. And again, we would like to thank Dr. Blackwood for joining us as well and providing great insight and knowledge, and really providing us, really uplifting our spirits as well as the evening ends. So thank you so much again, Dr. Blackwood, and we hope to see you again. For those of you who have also joined a little later, if you could kindly add your emails and names and phone numbers in the chat, it will be really great. This way will allow us to email you and let you know of upcoming programs and workshops that we have, especially for those that are very interested. So Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dr. Blackwood, again. And I hope you all have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Take care. Thank you, Dr. Blackwood.
Good night.
You're
Thank
so
you.
welcome. Okay, bye, everybody.